Chapter 3, Mishnah 1. The third parak of Tevul Yom discusses instances where a Tevul Yom came in contact with something that is not actual edible Turumah food, but rather something that is attached to the Turumah food in some way. Sometimes this is enough to render the Turumah pasul, but other times the two items are halachically considered separate, and the Turumah remains tahor. The Mishnah begins by teaching the fundamental rule of yados, handles of foods. We now turn to the words of the Mishnah. All yados of food items that are considered attached to the food when it comes to contacting tuma from an avatuma, for example, the stem of a fruit, are considered attached to the fruit itself when it comes to contracting tuma from a tevel yom as well. Although we have learned earlier in the Tractate that there are instances where two foods are considered connected with respect to the touch of an avatuma, but separate with respect to the touch of a tevel yom, the yad of a food is considered connected to it regarding avatuma and tevel yom alike. Thus, for example, if a tevel yom touches the stem of a turma olive, the olive will become pasul, even though the olive stem is inedible. The Mishnah turns to a different sort of case, a turma food that has no yad, which broke into two pieces that are still partially connected. We will use the example of a loaf of turma bread that split open into two unequal parts, which are still partly connected to each other. A tevel yom then touched one of the pieces, and the question is whether the two pieces are still considered one item, in which case both pieces are pasul, or whether they are considered separate, in which case only the piece the tevel yom touched would be pasul, while the other would remain tahor. The Mishnah cites a total of 4 different Tanaic views as to how we determine whether the two parts of the loaf are deemed to be connected or separate. If a food item broke apart into two pieces, but the pieces are still partially attached, Rebbe Meir says if, when one grasps the larger piece, the smaller one is lifted along with it, that is, it does not break off, then the smaller piece, is considered one with the larger piece. And if the tevel yom touched either piece, both pieces are pasul. But if the smaller piece breaks off when the larger piece is grasped and lifted, they are considered two separate items, and only the one that the tevel yom touched is pasul. But Rabbi Yehuda says, it is only if, when he grasps the smaller piece, the larger one is lifted up along with it, that the larger piece is considered one with the smaller piece. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it is not enough for the attachment between the pieces to be strong enough that lifting the larger piece will bring the smaller piece along. It must be strong enough that lifting the smaller piece will bring the larger piece along. This is a greater degree of attachment for the two to be considered one item. If lifting the smaller piece will cause the larger piece to break off, then the two are considered separate, and only the one that the tevel yom touched is pasul. According to both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, which piece we lift to determine whether the pieces of the loaf are still considered connected or not has to do only with their relative size. It does not matter which piece was touched by the tevel yom. The next two Tanaim, though, maintain that what is important is not which of the pieces is larger, but rather which of the two pieces was touched by the tevel yom. Rabbi Nehemiah says the way we judge whether the two parts of the food are deemed separate is by lifting the tahor part, that is, the part that the tevel yom did not touch, to see if the other part will be lifted up as well. If it is, the two pieces are treated as one, and both pieces are pasul. If it breaks off, only the piece that broke off, which the tevel yom touched, is pasul, and the part the person is holding remains tahor. But the sages say he lifts it up by the tameh part, that is, by the part that the tevel yom touched, whether large or small. If the second piece is lifted up as well, then both are pasul. If it breaks off, only the piece he is holding is pasul, and the other part is tahor. The Mishnah notes that with regard to some foods that do not have an inedible yad, part of the edible food itself will be considered its natural handle, and therefore the preceding dispute would not apply. Instead, a different method is used to determine if the two pieces are still considered connected. But when it comes to other food, namely vegetables of terumah that have partially broken apart, and we need to determine whether they are still considered legally connected because the tevel yom touched one of the pieces, the law is that if the vegetable in question is one of those that is normally grasped by its leaves, we grasp it by its leaves and see if the broken part separates from the rest. We do not take size or tuma status into consideration. And similarly, if it is a vegetable that is usually grasped by the stalk, we grasp it by its stalk to see if the pieces will remain connected. Since all the Tanai mentioned above agree that these vegetables are usually handled in this manner, they will all agree that this is the method we use to determine whether the pieces are considered connected or not.